Let's make an animated picker component, and we're gonna build it in React Native using Reanimated, gesture handler, and Expo-Image. Let's start by deciding on how to represent our animation in code. We can create two variables that drive animation and change based on user input. In Reanimated, we call these values shared because they are kept in sync over multiple JavaScript threads. In this specific example, let's define a value that controls if the picker is in the open state. It can animate from 0 to 1 once the user touches down on the picker, and then back from 1 to 0 once the user lifts the finger. Next, let's define a value that stores the vertical translation applied by the gesture. We could call it the current offset. Now we need just one more shared value. Since we want to update React state while the gesture is running, we'll need to store the initial offset before starting the gesture. This way, we can change the props on our component without breaking the animation. Cool, we've got that done. Now we can write our gesture. We'll use a pan gesture, since we want to track the translation of the finger after it touches down and stop when the finger is raised. Since we'll attach to a stationary gesture detector, we'll go back to that, we need the gesture to keep working if the finger leaves the gesture detector bounding box. It's easy, just set should cancel when outside to false. We now need to define our onBegin, onChange, and onFinalize handlers. In onBegin, we animate our picker open to 1 using the withTiming function. We'll also set initial offset based on the currently selected item passed into our props. OnChange fires on every frame of the gesture. We can set the current offset value based on our initial offset and the vertical translation of our finger. Let's make sure we clip our offset to start at 0, selecting the first option, and end at the max height of the list, selecting the last option. OnFinalize fires when the user raises his finger and the gesture ends. We can animate the picker open value back to 0 here. We can now render our UI components. First, we can add a gesture detector to the scene to capture gestures. Since it will be stationary, we need to wrap it around an empty view of a correct size. Once we remove the background, it's invisible, exactly as we want it to be. Next, let's render a component for each of our gradients. We can call it a gradient label. To actually animate the position of each label, we'll add a wrapper responsible for animations and styles. We can call it a gradient box and pass all our shared values to its props. Let's take a look inside. First, let's define our component. Next, let's use a special hook, useAnimatedStyle, to compute style properties dynamically based on our shared values. Let's compute a few variables first. We can use these variables to set some styles of our view using interpolate and interpolate color functions. We can then pass the animated style object to an animated view component. Let's also give it an absolute position so it's placed under the gesture detector when not translated, and disable pointer events. Last, we can use a blur view to make it fancier. Phew, that was a lot. Luckily, just two more things remain. One, we need to go back to our picker component and update React state based on the gesture as promised. We can use a useFrameCallback hook to achieve that. Let's call the setGradientIndex callback and trigger some haptics effects. Since both functions need to be run on the JavaScript thread and our gestures run on the UI thread, let's use the run-on.js helper to easily send events from one thread to the other. Now, we just need those animated backgrounds. Luckily, we can use Expo-Image with the transition prop set. To make it a bit fancier, let's also add a new shared value, animate it every time we load the new image, and use the value to displace the image a bit, same as we've already done in the picker. Here's the final result. Check out the full source code in the description. I'm Alek, and I work at Software Mansion. We are the creators of tools that you use every day, like Reanimated, Gesture Handler, and the React Navigation native stack. We are a software agency, and we'd love to work with you. Learn more at softwaremansion.com.